Hello, everyone, and welcome to this virtual conference on sustainable and scalable mini-grid business models organized by the African School of Regulation, the ASR, in collaboration with the African Development Bank, with the the African Forum for Utility Regulators, the African Minigrid Developers Association, AMDA, GIAP, the Global Energy Alliance for the People on the Planet, and IRENA, the Agency for Renewables, plus the participation of experts from other organizations. Thank you very much for helping us to make this conference possible. I'm Ignacio Perez Arriaga. I'm the interim director of the ASR. We expect that in 2024, the ASR will be hosted in some African institution and will have an African director. Transitorily, the ASR initiative is managed by the Florence School of Regulation, and we have a small team, partly located in Florence and partly in others in other parts of Africa and Europe. We have for this conference a great audience of about 400 people registered from many countries in all continents except for Antarctica. So we have to do better next time. I'm going to give a few practical announcements on how the conference will be run, and after that, some representatives from the co-organizing institutions will address you briefly to open this event. So first of all, let me say that this is a special kind of conference, except for a couple of short introductory presentations that will establish the framework of what we will be debating for the next 3 days. The rest of the conference will consist on debates among experts with ample time to present their viewpoints. So in general, no PowerPoints will be used. In the conference, we will have two groups of participants. We have the first group are the moderators and the panelists who will have the right to speak and will participate in the panels. And these participants have received a personalized link to join the conference, the same for the 3 days. And please have your micros muted when you are not in the panel that you are scheduled to participate, right? The second group of participants, most of you have received a link, the same for the 3 days, but you will not have speaking rights. So, however, you can place comments in the chat box, and also you can ask questions in the Q&A box. If there is time during the panels, the moderators may pick up some of these questions to be answered by the panelists. But if that doesn't happen, and probably only few of these questions could be taken, the ASR team, I promise, will take care of trying to answer the questions offline. And thank you for your understanding on this. There is translation from English to French only, and not vice versa, as we understand that all the speakers in this conference will use English, even if it is not your first language. To listen in French, you have to go to the translation button. You have interpretation, and with a globe, right? And you choose the French channel. And there will be no recording on the French channel because the conference will be recorded, but only in English. All speakers have received a form to formally agree with this procedure, so the conference can be made available at the ASR website as an additional training resource. So this is how the panel sessions will be run. All speakers have been asked to send a short bio and a good quality photo. You have access to this information at the ASR website. So there is no need for detailed introductions in the sessions. The moderator will have about 5 minutes to frame the topic, and then each panelist will also have something like 5 to 7 minutes to make a statement on the topic of the panel. And after that, the moderator will guide the debate, asking questions to clarify points made or to introduce new ones and giving an opinion if he believes or she believes that. And then panelists may raise their hands to request to intervene at any time. They will be asked to speak at the discretion of the chairman, the moderator, and please try to have these interventions short, right? And moderators must take care that the sessions finish exactly on time. Then after the conference finishes, something that we want to do is to prepare a brief summing up the main topics that we discuss in the different sessions and highlighting the findings and maybe eventual conclusions reached at the conference. The document will be written following Chatham House rule, so no attribution to anybody of the opinions, and comments will be sought and welcomed. Some of the speakers later may be asked to be interviewed or to participate in ad hoc panels to give their opinion on the topics that have been discussed during the conference. And all of you will be asked to provide feedback about the conference so that we could do better next time. Because something which is an important message from the ASR is the following. We plan to run more of these 3-day virtual conferences, one every 1 or 2 months, on key and timely regulatory topics on the energy sector in Africa. And we consider that these 3-day conferences are going to help us to build somehow the body of doctrine of the school that we will follow in the training, research, policy dialogues, and resources that we will place in the knowledge platform. So we are going to take these conferences very seriously. The ASR has proposed as reading material, as you know, for this conference, a position paper that is available at the website with ample references that establishes most of the discussion points for the panels that we will be presenting. We shall review it and we'll add more material as an outcome of the conference. And you, of course, may suggest other reading materials and other points of view. And now this is the end of my introduction, practical matters. In alphabetic order of their organizations, I shall pass the word to representatives of the co-organizing entities, if they are available. The first one would be from the African Development Bank, Wale Sonibare. I don't know if you are available at the moment.
I hope you can hear me,
yes,
Professor.
Very well. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good afternoon, dear participants, ladies and gentlemen. And a very warm welcome to the African School of Regulation Minigrid Conference. On behalf of the African Development Bank, I sincerely wish to thank you all for this opportunity to contribute further to these important discussions that aim to improve Africa's energy regulation and policy. I would like to acknowledge the African School of Regulation and fellow organizers of this conference who are all connected today: Africa Minigrid Developers Association, African Forum for Utility Regulators, the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, and the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, and also our very own Sustainable Energy Fund for Africa, SEFA, for their continued collaboration, engagement, and support and contributions. Without this commitment and foresight, we wouldn't be here today. As you all know, the world continues to grapple with the after effects of COVID-19 pandemic. The last 2 years have been shaped by this, a period in which the global calendars were reshuffled, investment plans froze, and financial projections shifted. The interruption in international trade and investment culminated in deferred investments in some sectors, disrupted supply chains, and an overall decline in the announcement of project finance deals coming to market, a situation that is particularly affecting our region and our sector. It has therefore become imperative for us to build economies back better and forward by ensuring that we build economic resilience for Africa. And a key part of this is to reverse the massive decline in foreign investment that Africa has faced. Over the past decade, we've seen the mini-grid sector slowly evolve to enable a more mature off-grid utility model, which we believe will be transformative for energy access in emerging markets, while national grids in sub-Saharan Africa remain the main power source. Off-grid utilities, solar home systems, and power grid can combine efforts to unlock universal electrification faster. It is estimated that at least 100 million people in low-income areas are more than 25 kilometers from the grid, where there is sufficient population density would be electrified at the lowest cost using mini-grids, essentially. There's likely a conservative estimate, as other research suggests, that the potential of mini-grids could be much greater. Despite the vast emerging market demand for energy, off-grid utility developers have struggled for financial viability and access to finance that would enable scaling across rural markets. So financiers have been reluctant to take the gamble on this sector with so many risks ranging from macroeconomic to regulatory to commercial, especially in rural areas where there's rarely sufficient data to support demand forecasts. In addition, governments in many countries have either lacked a policy framework for off-grid utilities or simply do not have the data demonstrating that they are long-term reliable solution for their rural customers. So investors will need a certain level of confidence that there will be financial return, and we have to bring together systematic donor interventions that will be a catalyst to allow the sector to attract commercial capital and implement sites at scale in order to reduce costs in a meaningful way. So we believe the potential for mini-grids will be best realized if they're positioned and operated as professional utilities at scale, and we need to bring in the collaboration of the private sector and regulatory agencies. It would take an estimated $7 to $11 billion a year to extend the mini-grid coverage necessary to make SDG 7 a reality. And the African Development Bank remains determined to continue to leverage its financial instruments and policy dialogue, as well as strategic alliances, to remove regulatory bottlenecks and common obstacles to finance. So we do count on the support and participation of the organizations represented here today, and your participation in this conference is positive proof that we can all come together to resolve many of these issues in order to create a viable path for the development of Africa's mini-grid sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wale. So the next speaker will be James Manda from the Africa Forum for Utility Regulators. James?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ignacio. James Manda from the African Forum for Utility Regulators, like Yanasha has already mentioned. And so this topic is very, very close to our hearts at the African Forum for Utility Regulators. And I would like to point out a few things that may be discussed for the 2 and the 3. Now, we all know that the last decade has seen a shift towards greater private participation in the development of infrastructure, especially in the renewable energy. Now, this is more so in the development of electricity infrastructure. Now, whilst most governments are reducing their roles as owners of or operators of facilities, we see a trend where governments are taking up some role in the development of renewable energy infrastructures. Now, as you may all be aware, very few utilities in Africa are profitable right now. I may not be able to point out the names, but some utilities are in the red in billions of their local currencies. And so, whilst we want to provide infrastructure and develop our capacity to develop the renewable energy infrastructures, we hope that there will be a time and an opportunity to speak to government functionaries and see how they can let go of the pivotal role that they play in developing infrastructure as owners. From the point of view of Africa utility regulation, we would like to suggest that governments must play the role of facilitators and not the role of a player in the electricity market. Right now, Auda NEPAD has established the African Continental Power Systems Master Plan. Now, this is an ongoing initiative led by the African Union, and it aims to establish a long-term continent-wide planning process for power generation and transmission, which will include renewable energy, decentralized systems. And our hope is that the private sector will take a greater role in establishing these accelerated energy transitions other than the governments. Now, we are passionate about what we call demonstration projects. The pathway for supporting accelerated energy transitions in Africa depends on demonstrating the fact that we can do it at small regional levels. What I mean by this is that we hope there will come a time when we develop the rationale for developing local energy communities to demonstrate a particular technology in a particular area, and then invite stakeholders, private sector, to scale up these renewable energy projects, which shall respond to the needs of local communities for a sustainable energy supply. Because we are aware that not all communities in Africa have one energy resource. They have different energy resources. And so, looking forward, we hope that developers of these renewable energy systems can look at particular needs of people in different local areas and develop those energy systems in those local energy communities to indicate that this can actually work. We are also trying to de-risk the promotion of private sector participation in energy projects in Africa. As you may be aware, a lot of perception about the risks in Africa. There is the political risks, which is associated with political events that adversely impact the value of investments. There is the policy or regulatory risk, which is associated with changes in legal or regulatory policies that have significant adverse effects on project development or implementation. And then there's also what we call the off-taker risks. And I've intimated already that most off-takers in Africa are government-owned, vertically integrated utilities, and they are not, their balance sheet is not very healthy. So we hope that we can find mechanisms to de-risk these risks that I've just highlighted. The other risk that I want to, the currency risk is also one of those risks that is associated with changing or volatile foreign exchange rates that adversely impact the value of investments. These arise when there's a currency mismatch between assets, revenues, and liabilities, which is a debt financing. So from the regulatory point of view, we hope that the successful transitioning of the energy sector will depend on mitigation of all or some of the above identified risks and challenges. And so we hope that going forward, we can make Africa the destination of choice, because in our opinion, we think that most of these risks are only perceived, but we want to de-risk these processes and show the investors that actually investing in Africa can be quite a profitable venture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James. I don't see, oh yes, Jessica, you are there, great. So the next one will be Jessica Stephens from the Africa Minigrid Developers Association. Jessica?
Hi, Ignacio. Hi, everyone. Ignacio, and to the African School of Regulators team, thank you so much for organizing this event and for allowing us to participate. It's really exciting to be here, and it's super exciting to have a unifying body that's trying to bring together all of the disparate aspects of the regulatory market to create a unified vision of what should happen going forward. I think that both Wale and James did a really wonderful job of scene setting, and I don't want to repeat what's already been said. So I will try and keep this extremely brief, as I think I have to present what's happening in the market. Really, as AMDA, we're really excited to be collaborating with all of the different players in the market, and it's very exciting to have so many different important bodies working together to think about how we regulate the market. And as we approach the next 3 days, I think what I want to leave everyone with as we're starting out is what the future of energy in Africa could look like. And we have this opportunity, given where the market is right now, to have a much more integrated energy market that allows us to pull multiple resources into the grid, as well as operate assets in island mode, whether or not they're integrated or not. And right now, the technology that currently exists and that's evolving with smart meters and remote verification and remote monitoring gives new players entering the African market this really robust opportunity to create the most efficient operational assets in the world. And actually, we're working with the UK utilities on sort of north-south sharing as they're trying to upgrade and integrate their grid into smart systems. And so I think we're going to talk a lot about the things that are going wrong, but I think it's really important as we progress this conversation to think about the opportunity of how we build an energy system for the future in Africa and what the regulatory and financial structures that could enable that to happen. I'm going to go ahead and close there because I know that there's a few other people who need to speak, and I will be talking again in a few minutes. But thank you, Ignacio, and to the African School of Regulators team for having us here today and for organizing and bringing everyone together.
Thanks to you, Jessica. Next one will be Wale Aboyade from GIAP.
Thanks, Ignacio, and hello, everyone. We're really excited to be here. And really want to take some time to really appreciate Ignacio and the FSR team for doing all this hard work of standing up the ASR up to this point. But also, you've been doing this in collaboration with the PAU and other partners like RMI, and this is, I'd like to appreciate that whole team. In addition, of course, with our partners like the World Bank and Rockefeller that has invited us as GIAP to join this conversation. And maybe it's actually a good time to introduce myself and GIAP, the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet that I represent, because I suspect not everyone here on this call would have heard about us. So my name is Wale Aboyade. I'm a director in the Africa Delivery team of GIAP, GIAP being the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet. This is an alliance that was set up or initiated at COP26, which is the Conference of Parties before the last one in Glasgow, by major philanthropies that came together to decide to do something really big and impactful in trying to reduce energy poverty, but in a low carbon way. And so GIAP was set up to work with these philanthropies, but more, and with all the other actors relevant to the energy sector, development partners, the private sector, and more specifically government, to help catalyze investment, especially private sector investment, into the energy sector in developing countries to deliver on the electrification and decarbonization goals. GIAP's currently operating 13 countries, in emerging economies, about 8 of them in Africa. And in every single country we're operating in and working in, it was at the request of the governments in those countries. So we I'm really, really glad to be here, glad to be part of these discussions on mini-grids. We think that, first of all, mini-grids themselves as one basket in the solution of addressing energy poverty is, super critical for all the reasons that my other partners have said, but also the need to improve the regulations and, as Jessica mentioned, where possible, even share good lessons that we might have to other markets is also critical. And, for those reasons, we really look forward to this conversation and this discussion. So I'll just park it there. Just safe to say that we really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to partake. I know I have some colleagues on the call who will actually be participating as panelists during the next 2 to 3 days, and we look forward to some actionable sort of like discussions that can move the mini-grid regulatory procedure forward. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Wal. And I must say that GIAP is one of the members of the partnership that is behind this initiative to create the African School of Regulation. Thank you. And last, in alphabetical order only of the institutions, from Irina, Rabia Ferruki.
Thank you so much, Ignacio. It's really a pleasure for me to welcome you for this 3-day conference. And that's on behalf of IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, where I'm the Director of Knowledge, Policy and Finance. And obviously, we're very, very pleased to have partnered with the different institutions that you already mentioned, Ignacio, by name. I'm not going to repeat that. For us at IRENA, a critical piece of a just and inclusive energy transition is to achieve, obviously, universal energy access, and that in a timely manner. This means, of course, that we need to make sure that we have affordable and reliable energy, but also sufficient energy is available to households, farms, businesses, schools, clinics, etc., so that they're aligned with the aspiration of growth and development. This has been an angle that we have always pushed for in the work that we've done at IRENA. So obviously, decentralized energy renewable solutions have an important role to play in achieving this goal alongside centralized approaches. And with decreasing costs and innovations in financing and delivery models, their adoption has grown. IRENA statistics finds that renewables-based mini-grid solutions provided electricity to over 11 million people in 2021 globally. That's up from 9 million in 2016 when we started the data collection. The challenge that lies ahead of us is to devise regulatory approaches that can drive a scale-up in mini-grids development while ensuring sustainability, inclusiveness in access, maximizing socioeconomic benefits, and creating local value. So IRENA has been working extensively on this topic, in particular looking at the best practices in mini-grid regulation design, as well as opportunities for creating local value along the supply chains. For example, we've done micro-hydro. And we find that regulations also have to keep pace with innovations in the sector, with new applications like interconnected mini-grids and mesh grids. So it is really timely that we have this workshop and that we have a platform that brings together regulators, private sector, financing institutions, development partners, etc., to discuss the next phase of growth of the sector towards scalability and sustainability. It is just my last point, also important to look at the power sectors and how it interacts with the other systemic layers, be it energy, economy, society, and planet, and the interaction between them, and also how international regulations, trade, commerce, etc., influence the sector and may hamper some of the local development. So with that, I wish you all a very fruitful discussion, and I look forward to continuing our collaboration in the sector. Thank you very much. Ignacio, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rabia, and thank you for emphasizing the role of regulation. We we do agree on that very much. Okay, so we start now with the presentation component of the conference. Will be quite short. We have 20 minutes for Jessica and myself to make a presentation. So you have 10 minutes each. Jessica, I assume that you will be using some slides, probably, or I don't know. And you will have to share your screen, and then we move ahead. And you have 10 minutes, and I have another 10.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ignacio. Just give me 30 seconds to pull up the deck. There's, as usual, too many things on my.
And of course, we will make available the slides afterwards, but I don't want people now to be looking at their slides. I want to be listening to what we say.
Yeah, I'm struggling to get it pulled up. I'm really sorry. Give me just one second. There we go. All right, thanks, Ignacio. I will try and be very brief because I know that the panel sessions will be probably a lot more interesting than our presentation. Just very briefly to jump in, for those who don't know myself or AMDA, AMDA is the African Minigrid Developers Association. We represent private sector minigrids across the African continent, and right now represent the bulk of developers who are currently developing assets across the continent. I think, we heard a lot in the introductions about what the scope is and what the need is. And I think what's also really important to highlight is how slow the pace of development currently is. Right now, private sector mini-grids represent a very, very small fraction of new connections. They've electrified about 500,000 people over the last 8 years. And so in order to meet the current needs and the status that have been represented on the introduction by Giap and Ignacio and Irina, and the African Development Bank, I think we're quite a long way from that scale, and there's a few things that are affecting that. AMDA works across, it's a little bit about us, we work across 3 different bodies. The first is on policy, advocacy, and regulatory environment, which is what we'll talk about today. We also work on access to finance in the sector and how we improve the kinds of capital that are flowing into the market and make sure that they're fit for purpose for developing this kind of infrastructure. And then at the very end, we work on data and research and providing robust benchmarking information for the sector so that people can make good decisions moving forward. So I'm going to very briefly jump into sort of what we're seeing in the regulatory environment in mini-grids. I'm making an assumption that everybody on the call roughly knows what a mini-grid is. So part of what AMDA does in our data and research portion is look at regulatory environments and look at what it's taking to get through regulatory compliance in a number of different markets. And so what we see is an extraordinarily long timeline in order to get through regulatory compliance for what is essentially very small assets. So the vast majority of mini grids that are being developed in Africa are under 100 kilowatt systems for really remote infrastructure. Obviously, the range that we represent is 50 kilowatts roughly up until under 10 megawatts, but the majority of the assets are in this like 50 to 200 kilowatt system. And so what we see is this really long timeline. It takes about 58 weeks to get through the full series of regulatory compliance. That's actually an increase from what we saw in the data from 2019, which is an increase of 4 weeks on average. Right now, there is not a single regulator in Africa that's approving more than 50 sites a year. I think we see the most out of Nigeria and Sierra Leone at the moment, but the current pace of approval is far below what we need in order to see the rapid increase in rural electrification through mini grids. So to highlight a couple of winners in the market, right now it takes about 31 weeks from start to finish to get through the Nigeria regulatory process, and the World Bank in conjunction with the Rural Electrification Agency and NERC have worked really hard to try and streamline that process. In Kenya, we're at about 38 weeks, but as I said, the average across Africa is 58 weeks. And so in markets like Madagascar and Tanzania and Zambia, we see really long timelines that are impacting the ability to scale. this is a great slide that looks at overall financing. I'm just going to pull out sort of one tiny piece of this. As we're thinking about, investment across the sector or across the energy infrastructure in Africa, as you can see from this, there's a very small amount of capital that's actually being deployed to mini grids, and a roughly equivalent amount that's being invested in market support. And if we're actually going to build out a decentralized energy system and build an energy system for the future, we need to see a pretty radical increase in what's going into both the mini grid market as well as the market support vehicles for regulators. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the issues that we're seeing in the market. The first is about regulatory resourcing and pacing. And right now, regulators just don't have sufficient funding or resources or the logistical infrastructure to visit and approve mini grids at any sort of scale. We also see this issue, which I'm sure will get talked about quite substantially over the course of the next 3, which has to do with consumer pricing. And right now, we have a mini grid market that has been explicitly designed to ensure that the consumer bears the cost burden for electrification, but that's actually not politically viable. And what we're seeing in the implementation of regulations is that regulations are being used to slow down the pace of mini grid development because of the high pricing. And so this is so critical in the intersection of how we're thinking about the sector and how we move things forward. Regulatory implication on CapEx is actually quite high. So this sort of goes to the consumer pricing issue. If we want to have lower pricing, we need to figure out how to streamline regulations in order to both deploy mini grids at scale, which will bring down operations costs, but also to build in structures for regulatory compliance that lower the CapEx costs to get through compliance. Right now, that's about 5 to 8% of the overall cost to build an asset, which is extremely high when we're thinking about trying to electrify rural populations, and that cost is getting carried on to the end consumer. And I think there's this limitation on existing regulations. So I think in the early days when we were building regulations in Tanzania and Nigeria in 2015 and 2016, we were really trying to pilot a set of regulations to think about how this could be done. But right now, those existing pilot regulations that were not designed for scale are being replicated across the continent. And so while what we're measuring through a multitude of tools to say if a market is ready is whether or not they have regulations, but we're not actually assessing whether or not those regulations are going to be effective in scaling mini grid deployment in that market or ensuring that those assets are actually safe for consumers. And so I think we need to start rethinking how we do regulations to address those two issues. So a couple of other just like very, very high level things. So we've talked a little bit about funding for regulators. There's a couple of solutions right now that we're starting to see emerge. So the first is portfolio applications. Right now, most markets are regulating mini grids on an individual basis, which means for every 100 kilowatts of power you're putting into the ground, you're going through a regulatory process that takes 58 weeks. 58 weeks is fine if you're building 10, 20, 30 megawatts of power, but it's not sustainable if you're only building 100 kilowatts and you have to go through that process every single time. Contracts and concessions. I think we've seen the vulnerability in the market, particularly in Tanzania, that's appeared over the last couple of years. And the importance of contracts and concessions that underpin regulation is going to become more and more important if we want to address the issue that Wale was raising around bringing in capital into the African market. Digitization and remote approval. Right now, regulatory approval is done on paper. It is a paper process that requires multiple visits from different regulatory bodies in the government to visit each asset. And again, that's fine if your plan is to build 10, grid scale IPP projects over the next 10 years. That doesn't work if you need to be deploying 300, 400, 1,000 mini grids in a year. And then I think the last point that doesn't get talked about enough is regulatory stability. It is so important that we're seeing continuity in the regulatory process. Right now, because the regulatory process was built under this sort of pilot structure in a lot of markets, the regulation is now being revised, and then it's being revised again, and it's being revised again. And the regulatory purgatory and the uncertainty of what's going to happen in a regulatory market is killing investment. It creates so much uncertainty about what is going to happen that it's driving down investment. And so creating that stability from the beginning, that we know that the regulations are going to be in place and valid for a multitude of time. And so just thinking, this is my last slide, and then I'll hand this back over to Ignacio. But I think as we think about, in the context of the next 3 days and the context of the next few years, as we build out this integrated energy future, how we can collaborate. And I think there's a couple of, maybe low-hanging fruit or simpler things that we can start thinking about. I think the first, which is not a simple thing, is actually thinking about how we provide the right kinds of concessional capital for mini grids and to balance cost, consumer pricing, and service provision. And so right now there is a disproportionate, as you saw from that graph a few graphs ago, there's a very small amount going into mini grids. There's a very small amount going into the regulatory office to build capacity, but we have a huge amount going into other parts of the ecosystem, and leveling that out so that we actually do have a robust service and grid redundancy is going to be super important. We need to create national funds that can support regulators to overscale and compliance. The amount of work that is going to need to double the number of connections, triple the number of connections over the next 8 years is enormous. Whether or not it's mini grid or grid integrated, there's so much work that needs to be done, and our regulators are so underfunded and do not have the ability to keep up with the pace because of that systemic underfunding. We need to start thinking about how to build contracts into the regulatory process through concessions or other agreements with governments that start to protect developers, so that we're able to leverage in the kind of infrastructure investment that we can see to scale. The IFC isn't going to be making $50, $60, $100 million deals to build out mini grids and markets if we can't securitize them. And right now we can't create any security because there's no contract that underpins any of those agreements. I think this piece that's super low hanging is the digitization of the regulatory process. And I know that there's a lot of people who are starting to think about, how do we digitize this process? How do we make it move faster? And how do we make it more efficient? And then I think the last thing is thinking about policy reform, trying to create regulatory stability while we balance the political realities of consumer pricing, oversight, and operational viability. And it's super important that we build that consistency across the market that creates a stable framework for developers to operate in. I'll hand this over to Ignacio. I think I've expunged my 10 minutes, but happy to answer any questions on the side. And I know Ignacio will share the deck with you at a later date.
Thank you, Jessica. Great presentation. I'll try to do my best now. Okay. So this is really a follow-up to everything that Jessica has said. What I'm going to say is maybe I am a dreamer, but I want to present what it could take to have a sustainable and scalable mini-grid business model, framing what I think should be the objective of the discussions that we will have during the next 3 days. So I'll try to frame the problem. And I will start by saying that the debate that I would like to have is more on thinking what are the regulatory and business models that will enable something very ambitious, the sustainable development, of all the mini-grids that are needed to achieve a complete electrification of a country. So it's not about facilitating the installation and operation of some mini-grids as independent projects, which is always a good thing to do. And I immensely respect the professionals, both mini-grid developers, the DFIs that try also to do miracles, trying to finance and to provide warranties to mini-grids, and the regulators that they do their best. But I am presenting like a even more ambitious and more difficult challenge, right? And okay. So when we talk about sustainable mini-grid business model, I mean a model that without basically any major changes in that business model could remain operational, supplying a given community forever, for an indefinite period of time. So not for a few years, forever. As the distribution company that I have supplying my electricity where I live now in Madrid, I assume that it will be forever. And a mini-grid model should be sustainable from the developer's perspective, where, I mean, Jessica has been insisting a lot, also from the government's perspective, so that what this plan to provide electricity to everybody with all the mini-grids that are needed is economically, financially viable from the perspective of the government also. And the other quality is to be scalable. And scalable means that should be able, that business model, to attract all the investment that is needed to install and operate all the mini-grids that must be deployed in a territory, for instance, a country, by a given target date, according to some electrification plan. So really very ambitious. So what are the issues with the present business models? And I will overlap a lot with what Jessica has said. Well, I attended this webinar by ERRA, the Energy Regulators Regional Association, that is also present in Africa, with some of the speakers are common to the speakers that we have in this conference. And well, it was very clear that there are a number of very serious problems in the business models that we have now. So first of all, the mini-grid problem is contemplated by itself in a silo, separately from the standalone solutions and in grid extension, in design, in deployment, in operation, in cost, in financing, in tariffs, and customer relations. It is considered like a different animal, except maybe in some countries that they have a electrification planning that includes the 3 modes, and in some regulations that include what happens when the grid arrives or under the grid mini-grids. But in principle, each business is considered as a separate thing, which I think it is hurting all of the 3 businesses. Second, lack of legal security for the mini-grid business. There's only a few countries that have developed mini-grid regulation with cost-reflective tariff designs, with regulated options when the grid arrives, but with no guarantee that inefficiently incurred cost of service will be covered. It is defined what a cost-reflective revenue requirement would be, but this is it. No clear path on how to recover that cost. Most mini-grids, existing mini-grids, have been built with concessional money. You can see that from the graph that Jessica presented, or taking advantage of anchor loads and internal cross-subsidization that are only valid for some cases, but cannot be scaled to all the mini-grids that are needed. The funding is mostly implemented as initial capital subsidies, and that leads to, as a result, that there is a high risk that those business models will end up not being sustainable, because there will be more injection of capital later and more subsidies, but the programs only take into account the initial situation. Then, for the mini-grid developers, I think there is a 3-way dilemma. Regulators and politicians don't want to raise the tariffs. Donors want small grants because they want to have their money that they have available to be used, spread out in many different projects. And if you ask some for funding from commercial investors, they will want a high rate of return that would result in higher tariffs. So it is impossible to reconcile these 3 requests. The consequences are that the poorest people pay the highest tariffs in the country, more than the people that are connected to the grid, much more. So that means that the model is not scalable. It is difficult to attract private investment because of the legal insecurity that I was mentioning before, and because you cannot have high rate of return and low tariffs at the same time. And then the scarce funding results in small or medium-sized projects, even individual ones, as Jessica was commenting, so that the cost of regulation and all the red tape is a large percentage, and there is a limited ambition in the developers and the countries, well below Sustainable Development Goal 7, that in principle, according to some estimates, we would need 200,000 mini-grids being developed in Africa with a cost of $125 billion. Of course, that is not achievable with the business models that we are commenting now. So let's try a bold approach. And why is it bold to consider to use the best practices that have worked elsewhere in distribution and do that for mini-grids, considering distribution in a more holistic way? So what has worked in distribution elsewhere? Well, cost of service remuneration, including an attractive, reasonable rate of return. And that, as Jessica said, will be favored with a concession contract that is, if well written, will reduce the financial risk considerably, and also could provide a long-term perspective if the contract is written for, I don't know, 20 years, 25 years, which is the life of, or even shorter than the life of many of the assets that are used in mini-grids. So that means expanding the concept, the idea of distribution, to consider the 3 electrification modes, not only in doing an integral planning and decided that here should be grid extension and here should be standalone systems and here mini-grids, also extending the principle that applies in every country, also in Africa, of course, of cross-subsidization between the customers. So I pay in my apartment in Madrid at this moment the same that people that live in the countryside, where the cost of distribution is several times more expensive than it is in downtown Madrid. In every country, people connected in urban or rural areas pay the same. Why not to extend that to mini-grids that provide a service that is comparable or even better than the one that have the people connected to the main grid? What works in distribution elsewhere? Well, financing utilities should be contemplated from a long-term perspective. The regulation of distribution in Denmark, in Italy, in Florida, in Australia, when it is done well, is considering that the assets have a long life and that the business models are smoothing out the discrete investments, and the investments are recovered over a long time. When we think that, if we have the same tariffs for people in mini-grids and people in a standalone, connected to the grid, we'll have a very large subsidy. That's fine. This is true. But you have a lot of time to recover that subsidy. You can borrow money to cover the subsidy and return the money in a long period. And if you think that this is impossible, I can tell you that I have the numbers. I've done the very detailed numbers for the case of Uganda, which is not an easy country. And the numbers say that if we are patient, we have concessional loans with a grace period of several years and a low return and this and that, and we consider distribution holistically as grid extension, mini-grids, and standalone systems, you could return concessional debt and some part of commercial by 2040 and have electricity for everyone in 2030. So a plausible implementation scheme could consist, being bold, presenting that to DFIs, governments, cost of service remuneration established on a solid concession contract based on regulated tariffs, same for customers connected to the main grid, plus a subsidy. And from the viewpoint of the government, because that will be from the viewpoint of the developer, in an integrated way, and finding a financing that would be credible with a comprehensive financial plan. Of course, I said that I am a dreamer, but I am aware of pragmatic considerations. So the best is the enemy of the good, right? So, okay, why not to choose some one favorable country and prove the concept of country level. That could take long. It may require regulatory changes, and people are not patient. We have institutions like GIAP, institutions like others that have the money and want to do things quickly. Fine. Then if funding is available, continue deploying mini grids, as I say in my working paper, from the dark side of the force, but trying to get as close as possible to sustainable models, having a plan, talking with the regulators and the governments, and trying to turn these dark side business models into the bright side of the force with some time, so that you will be saving some time by deploying mini grids close to the business that we have now. But we could do quite well anyway. And of course, we need scalability. And my point is scalability is only possible if there is sustainability, if the business models are sustainable and the private capital sees that they will have to have a reasonable rate of return with a reasonable guarantee that it will happen, and with a contract that will be helpful, right? And of course, scalability can benefit from other measures, not only the guarantee of recovering the cost, but you have to use adequate technology. This is from the side of the developers. Estimate the demand properly, optimize the design, efficient operation, maintenance, digitization, economies of scale, doing the procurement right at the scale also, and improve the affordability by electricity, enable economic activities, which is a very important part of the equation. And okay, so with that, we'll jump into the program. We have divided the program into three clear differentiated parts. Day one is the one that to talk about the experiences, the problems that we are having with the models that we have, what works, what doesn't. And we have classified, broadly speaking, the models into two types, and that will be explained shortly. So experiences, what is the situation? Day two is the day to go in depth into what are the regulatory problems and how to try to address them. So what should be the regulation for inclusive and sustainable mini grids, how to achieve scalability, and how to try to implement that. And third day is more like a wrap-up, identifying what are the open issues in regulation, business models, financial issues, so to have a clear vision of what remains to be done, what is not solved, what are the problems, and then talking at the end about what is next. Because as I said before, from the viewpoint of the African School of Regulation, we consider that this conference will establish what we will teach. So our action plan is to take good note of what is being said and use that in our training, capacity building, policy dialogues, etc. So others will do something, right? So we would like to hear what that will be. So this is day three. And with that, I will finish. We are left with 1 minute for coffee break. So let's have a coffee break of 5 minutes, and we will reconvene at 4:05 Central African time. Thank you very much. And maybe, Gassi, you could place the coffee break slide exactly. That one, a happy coffee break.
must transition to an energy model that is inclusive, enables industrialization and development, and contributes to the common universal goal of fighting climate change.
A number of barriers exist that prevent African countries from using the abundant energy resources available on the continent in an environmentally friendly way and in a manner that will promote inclusive growth and development. These barriers include the lack of regulations, the lack of institutions to design and implement the regulations, and the lack of a critical mass of professionals to manage the energy sector. It is precisely to address these challenges that the initiative has been launched to establish an African School of Regulation.
The combination of the viewpoints of engineering, economics, and law is vital to address these challenges. In response to these needs, a partnership of leading institutions deeply involved in the African energy sector and the global clean energy transition has launched the African School of Regulation initiative.
The African School of Regulation, the ASR, aims to be a center of excellence for education, applied research, independent discussion, and knowledge exchange, with the purpose of improving the quality of African energy regulation and policy.
In Africa, run by Africans and for Africa. The African School of Regulation will provide inclusive education designed by academics and practitioners to meet African professional needs, opportunities to share best practices and discuss freely present issues in African energy regulation, research for solutions to challenging current problems in energy regulatory practice, and a repository of indispensable and diverse resources. Join our efforts for a sustainable, reliable, and affordable energy in Africa.
Well, I think that we are ready to start again, and I think that the floor is for our moderator for the next two sessions, Jonathan Phillips. Go ahead.
Hi, Ignacio. Thank you, and thanks to the African School of Regulation for putting this event together and all the partners. Really a distinguished group you have here, and I love your kickoff video there. I'm Jonathan Phillips. I'm the director of the Energy Access Project at Duke University, based in the US. We have a research and policy program based on energy poverty in the global South and this linkage between energy and development. So I will be your moderator for these first two sessions today, and we are jumping right into the complicated technical weeds here in these two panels. And as Ignacio suggested, I will do the best I can to briefly try and frame some of the big issues and provoke our panelists. I think Ignacio has provoked us and Jessica as well in their openings. And then I'm going to turn it over to each of the panelists to really break us out of the theoretical or conceptual and give us the real view on what's working and what's not working, and where the efforts of this community are really key to unlocking the potential here for mini-grids in Africa. So there's a lot of interdependence in the issues that we're discussing over the next few days. And what I think we're trying to do with these first two panels is break apart some of that complexity and really examine existing approaches through two general lenses. One is a concessionary model in which we have a contract that clearly lays out things like where a mini grid is going to be located, how big it should be, who is getting what services, lots of other details on the system. And that's in contrast to what our program calls this session, the donor-driven or market-based approaches. And I'm using air quotes there because there are still, there's specific guardrails and regulations constraining what mini grids under these programs might look like. It's not like an unregulated market. And donors, of course, can support any number of models, including concessions. But these models, I think, that we're going to talk about first are generally more flexible, more focused on upfront capital subsidies to spur markets. So the concession approach will be the topic of the subsequent panel. Right now, let's jump into market-based approaches. So I'll just say 3 quick things here and then invite our panelists in. First is flexibility, siting and business model flexibility. A key design of any mini-grid program is how sites are chosen, and how a market-based approach works is it tends to give developers more flexibility in determining sites. But sites are going to be determined where profits can be maximized. And in practice, that can mean mini-grids more in peri-urban settings with favorable densities, higher demand, higher willingness to pay profiles. And market-driven siting can also facilitate great opportunities for bundling electricity delivery with other services like water provision or appliance or equipment leasing, things like this. And this type of value stacking can create alternative revenue streams for developers and lead to really innovative cross-subsidy models that can make electricity more affordable for low-income households. On the other hand, there's the question of scalability, which I think Ignacio got at in his opening. Is this a universal solution? Approaches that maximize developer flexibility in terms of siting and service delivery come with the reality that the market is going to snatch up those most profitable sites, and a lot of rural sites could be ignored. So just because a least cost electrification model points to mini grids as being, the answer, it really just means that the economics of mini grids could be less bad than the other options, right? It doesn't necessarily mean it's commercially viable. So market-based approaches really need to, for them to be scalable, there needs to be some sort of mechanism that incentivizes mini grid development at tougher sites and includes some sort of incentive that bridges that viability gap. And that viability gap could be very different site to site. So that's a challenge from the policy perspective. All right, last point from me is on the financial sustainability point. And the white paper that was circulated in advance of the conference, which is very good, by the way, it makes a very clear statement about the danger of upfront subsidies undermining the long-term sustainability of projects. And most market-based programs include some form of early stage payment to the developer. Frequently, it's a results-based financing approach where the developer gets paid after connections of households. Lots of advantages to this, right? The time value of money, $1, naira, kwacha today is worth more than it is tomorrow. It eliminates that uncertainty around whether the subsidy program will even exist 5 years from now and whether developers will get paid. And it can fund construction and provide the equity that developers need to borrow to cover the balance of upfront costs. And from a donor or government perspective, it can, it's a lot easier to write one upfront check than to manage a 10-year cash flow of subsidy payments. But all of this makes it easier for developers to get an investment out of a project earlier and walk away. So how do we square this subsidy and sustainability question? All right, I'm gonna stop there. I want to bring in our awesome panelists here. And as Ignacio suggested, I welcome our panelists to engage with each other and respond to points. So feel free to raise that hand button or jump in if you see a good opportunity to build on points or push back on points. But to start with, I want to give each person 3 to 5 minutes to tell us about how your organization fits into this topic. What are your experiences working on these types of market-based approaches, and what have the results been thus far? So Mukabanji Mutanuka is a renewable energy and development economist with Engie Energy Access based in Lusaka, Zambia. I'm going to give the floor to her first. Great to see you again, Muka.
Thanks, Jonathan. Great to see you. And I'm very excited to join the African School of Regulation on this very exciting conference. So I'm coming in from NG, and of course, we have been in the market as a special purpose vehicle of the real NG in delivering off-grid renewable solutions to bottom of pyramid customers. We are present in 9 markets, and within those 9 markets, we've been able to see the role that regulation plays, as well as the role of donor financing. All those in all, I think it will be a very exciting conversation today, because we have quite a number of experiences, some which are better than others, and of course some have been a bit more painful, but I think from those painful experiences, we could be able to learn on what better to refine, and also how we move forward going into the foreseeable future.
All right, great. Thank you, Muka. Brad Matson is the founder and CEO of Novella Systems and Matson Technology, as well as the co-founder, chairman, and CSO of renewable energy mini-grid company Husk Power. Thanks so much for joining us, Brad. Over to you. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, just trying to share my screen here, if I can. Okay, can you see that screen?
Yes.
Yep, we got it.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. As I mentioned, chairman of Husk Power, we build mini grids in both India and Africa. We have about 180 out there, so we have pretty good experience. We're also in India, mostly under the grid. The grid is there, so we have experience in working under the grid, and then we have experience in Africa working off the grid as well. Just the first thing I want to point out is, Ignacio, thank you for your setup there in talking about the dream. I love your dream in the concessionary markets. We're living a little bit in the real world where a lot of those don't exist right now. And so we're really on the right side of this graph, showing that Husk works mostly in commercially viable markets. And we think that's really key. And I just want to say that for the developer's point of view, is you don't have to wait for these things to occur. There really are 3 market buckets from what we can see. Is we have the markets we work in now that are commercially viable today. And incentives and subsidies help, but there is a working mini grid model. I'll show you what ours is. But then also there are markets, I think, as mentioned, that use RBFs, where you can consider those bridge markets where there's some subsidy you can have for a period of time, but they would also be viable after that. So I believe those are there. And of course, Ignacio has mentioned that does not get to everyone. And there are what we would call the concessionary markets. But developers don't have to wait. There are ways to participate now from our perspective, but there are definitely challenges. So I agree with the focus on sustainability. I think it's really the key. So having a viable business model, and we just recently talked to investors around the world, and believe me, I can tell you that this is the biggest investor concern is, do you have a viable mini-grid business model? The challenges we see there are cost. The costs do need to come down. The quality and service level have to be sufficient for the needs of the communities. But probably a big one is, unlike utilities around the world where you supply electrons and you're pretty much done. In most of the places where there's lack of energy access or quality of energy, there isn't the infrastructure. The infrastructure isn't there to have stimulated demand over time, and so often there isn't any demand. Or certainly there's not a lot of demand that would lead to socioeconomic development. So I think, unfortunately or fortunately, developers really have to play on both sides to make this whole business model work. You have to really focus on generating demand, or probably you won't have a viable business model. This is at least Husk's perspective is, if you don't do that, you're probably going to have a hard time with the viability of the business model. And even when you solve all those, I think that's the primary, getting sustainability. There is really a challenge in scaling. And so we've seen that as well. But what we've done at Husk is we've converted all that into a business model. But here's a business model that has a bunch of numbers in it. So we've taken those things, cost and quality and demand, and put metrics to them. So you could have KPIs. And we've charted over here, I won't get into this, it's too detailed, obviously, but the work the World Bank has done has done some great work in putting out numbers. Husk has recently proposed a much more aggressive roadmap that has numbers in there, and they may seem a little aggressive, but it's a reference on the right side. Husk is hitting a lot of these numbers already, and we really believe that a roadmap such as this can help focus investment in the industry to the technologies and business models and innovations necessary to drive these metrics in the right direction so you could achieve universal electrification. So won't get into the details, there's a lot there. So just wrapping up my 5 minutes, want to thanks to Ignacio and the conference organizers. This is a great concept, exactly where we're focused, sustainability and scale, with sustainability being the core issue. I want to encourage everyone to consider that, you know, developers don't have to wait. There are markets out there that with the current business models, without the concessionary programs, you can actually go out and participate, and we're doing that now. We're scaling at a fairly high rate without a lot of the, in some places there are frameworks, some places there are not. But you can work now and get going while the necessary frameworks for universal electrification are put in place. Developers could be building up their capacity to scale already. Husk has a sustainable business model. We hope to be announcing soon that we're going to be EBITDA profitable, so we can put some data points behind that. And we're also at the same time publishing to kind of sharing how we're getting that done by putting a roadmap out there and giving the industry metrics that we can all get together and debate and see, are these the appropriate ones? What should we be looking at? And how do we drive investment into the right business models and technologies that allow us to get there faster? And with that, I'll end my remarks. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Brad. And great job to you and the team on that roadmap document that you put together. I think that and the mini grids for $500 million that the SMAP team has done have really helped us put together a realistic set of benchmarks and targets for things like costs and how they might be coming down in the future. I'm going to turn next to Jaideep Mukhjeri, who is the CEO of Smart Power India. Thanks for joining us, Jaideep. I know before you were also managing director of the off-grid company D-Light, so you come at this from knowing a variety of how these modes operate. So thanks for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Hi, everyone. Yes, so I started at Smart Power India in 2015. It's 7 years plus, established by the Rockefeller Foundation. And we've been working on this whole mini-grid conundrum ever since. And so let me give you a little flavor of where mini-grids are in India at this point in time. So with our 5 mini-grid developing partners, Husk Power, OMC, and Tata Power in principle, there are about 700 private sector mini-grids operating in India. They've been all built without subsidy. They've been built with patient capital, debt, and equity. And this portfolio, as Brad mentioned, in India is largely operating under the grid, because the grid, over the last 7 years is now omnipresent. And it's basically addressing the gap in the grid services, which are patchy in vast swathes of India, particularly in the rural areas. And these mini grids have been able to complement and bring in the element of reliability, and which is particularly attractive for the enterprise activity and productive activity, which was the focus of these mini grids in terms of the customer base. And what's interesting is at the portfolio level, 80% of the electricity service goes to the productive use in India for these 700 odd mini grids. And just give you some data, roughly the tariff levels are about 30 to 35 cents per kilowatt hour. And 80% of the portfolio is profitable or cash positive at the unit level. The revenues are about $600 per mini grid, while the operating costs are about $300 to $400 per mini grid. 80% of the portfolio is profitable at the unit level. The other point is, speaking of regulation, the regulation in India is pretty practical. It's basically no regulation for the mini grids, other than the safety standards which are prescribed, Mini-grids can be established in any designated rural areas and can determine tariff on bilateral basis with the customers. So that's a flexibility that the environment provides. However, like I mentioned earlier, there is no special government incentive or subsidy here, and the portfolio continues to grow. There is a threat that remains, which is, what on a day, when the grid is completely reliable, what happens to the mini grid investment? But they've been around 7 years and continue to grow in spite of the grid becoming improving. So while the regulatory principles provide for an integration for feed into the main grid, but all those details are not clearly available, or have nowhere has that situation yet arrived where mini grids that have been built in carefully designated areas are under threat of being washed away. So that's the situation in India largely. However, I interact with my colleagues in Africa, and I also look at some of the investments that UEF under the the SE for All under the UF facility is making. And the picture in Africa, where mini grid appears to be a no-brainer, is extremely different, where I see very low capacity utilization under 20%. I see very high tariffs, 60 to 90 cents to the poorest people in the world. I see very high level of, one can call it high or not, but that's a separate question, but about $600 per connection incentive or subsidy, which for a 250 connection amounts to $150,000. Basically, the capex probably is paid for, and then I wonder, why is the tariff so high and the utilization so low? So that's a conundrum that needs to be figured out. And what I like when Ignacio mentioned about the whole integrated way of thinking about how do you provision electricity and bring about universal electrification. So you have to look at the plan between the grid, the mini grid, and the standalones, because if the customer base is largely lighting and small loads, why not standalones do that job and mini grids find the right place where they can go and service? So these are some points I think it'd be interesting to debate with the panelists as we go forward. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That's great, Jaideep. Brad, maybe I can go back to you on this point that Jaideep ended on. And there are a lot of sites that are viable already. I think you said 2 out of your 3 buckets are either mini grids that are viable, sort of unsubsidized, or viable after a single RBF payment. It sounds like in India, Jaideep's experience is something like 80% of mini grids are profitable. So how do we think about this issue of like universal access and mini grids being a part of this formula for achieving a universal access strategy? Are mini grids a valid intermediate step toward this sustainable and scalable approach that Ignacio laid out, or how do you weigh the profitable now versus maybe less profitable situations where mini grids are pointed to as sort of the option right now?
Yeah, well, I come from the semiconductor industry, then solar industry, where scale is everything. So when we're starting out, we have fairly low scale, and so the prices are high. So I think what happens here is you get started as we are now, and the prices are higher than desirable. But then you need scale to bring them down, and that should be happening. So I think what you do is you start with I think it was mentioned earlier, you could pick the easier markets, right? The ones that have a more ability to pay, so forth, and get started there, and then work your way down where you need more subsidy, basically at the same time, your prices come down as we achieve scale. So I think scale is an important factor in bringing costs down so you can get more universal access. But I don't think, mini grids are an interim solution. I think they're a solution now in many cases, because there are the alternative is diesel. We went into one of our first villages in Africa, and we eliminated 200 diesel generators because putting a mini-grid in. So we're competing. We're not competing with nothing. We're competing with diesel, and mini-grids are far better than diesel installations. So I think why not? We don't. As I mentioned earlier, we get started now. Developers can get going and start going down this learning curve. Replace the diesel generators in a lot of these places. And then as we put regulatory frameworks in place and we can work down to the more difficult communities, and yes, I believe that there will be, as I mentioned, one size doesn't fit all. There will be markets that do require permanent subsidies. There's markets that maybe just need a little boost from the beginning. I'm a developer. I don't want to really get into the regulatory framework, what is best. There are better experts here for that. But I just really believe that they're both a short-term solution where the markets are available, and later with the appropriate subsidies are a permanent solution as well.
Muka, anything you want to add there? How mini-grids, what is your vision for how mini-grids fit into this universal access puzzle now? And how do we get from where we are with some projects being profitable, but many of the potential projects that show up as mini-grid possible or likely or attractive on least cost models, maybe not having as favorable of economics?
Okay. So thanks for that. So electricity in itself is a loss-making venture usually, and rural electrification is even more expensive and much more complicated. So one thing that is a game changer is a holistic view of electrification in the light of all these commitments that most governments actually have towards 2030, or be it the SDGs. To start with, the electricity industry will obviously have on-grid, off-grid, but within the off-grid, there's obviously different solutions within there. There's obviously the standalone systems that Jaideep spoke about, as well as the mini-grid aspects. So looking at mini-grids or off-grid electrification as a silo, that should stop. If we're going to move this from being a business in survival mode to a business that is going towards sustainability, there has to be that comprehensive and holistic approach. If we're going to look at the different subsidies that we're going to push towards on-grid, what then are we pushing towards the off-grid to be able to move it to get to a point where electrification is the major outcome? So being intentional and deliberate at policy level, but then also the funding structures of the subsidies that we keep receiving, the subsidies that we keep talking about, should be tailored to actually look at the different peculiarities of the off-grid market. It's not an easy market to penetrate through, but if you have funding mechanisms that speak to a full utility scale business model that is already proven and is already in a point where it's at the point of scale, then it would not be a fair process within which we should also treat the off-grid renewables, and in this case, mini-grids as well.
Yes, great. And maybe just more on that subsidy point, Jaideep, mini grids are being dropped into an existing power system that is generally, heavily subsidized grid power kind of alternative, and that creates some complicated politics and economics when you start comparing costs, and no one wants this dynamic where your rural poor are paying more than urban wealthier populations. So how do you look at the subsidy question, and what is the role of subsidies in these different approaches, especially as we think about sustainability and scalability, and maybe perhaps since I know results-based financing mechanisms have been part of the formula in India, how has that worked? Are there ways that you think that those models could be tweaked, improved, et cetera?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, it's a interesting subject, and I think subsidies or incentives are definitely a part of an important part of the mix to deliver universal electrification, no matter by which mode you're doing it, whether it's a grid, a standalone, or the Minigrid specifically. Speaking of Minigrid here, if we kind of look at, is subsidy the problem? I think there's a lot of money chasing, or there's a lot of money already gone in and into Minigrid subsidies. What's happening there is something that we have to learn from. If a fully subsidized Minigrid is not able to use the asset to 60, 70, 80% of the capacity to service the community and deliver electricity at an affordable cost, because technically that the cost of your electron at your dispatch point is almost zero if it's fully subsidized. Yet you see very high tariff and very low utilization. So where is the problem? I think, data from all the Minigrid, have they been established in some area where they should not have been, or is there, the miscalculation about what the demand is, or what is it? I'm not sure, but I think it's important in Africa to have complete data transparency about what's going on in Minigrids, because there's a lot of money chasing Minigrids, but the results are not there. I call it Operation Successful, Patient Dead, because Minigrids are being built, but the community largely remains underserved or being served only for lighting loads, etc. You don't need Minigrids for doing lighting loads. You can do it at 1/3 the price or half the price by standalone systems. Then there are companies which are doing it admirably on pay-as-you-go, etc. But talking of incentives, financing, and subsidies, extremely important. But I think you have to disaggregate, unpack the whole thing from generation to the customer side. I feel where the subsidy element, so two things have to be ensured: that yes, the customers need to be provisioned electricity at a fair price. And it would be, why should they pay different from a grid customer? Unless you are providing some bespoke services, and there could be provisioning for that and certain flexibilities for that, or time of the day, innovative tariff mechanisms. But I think they have to be affordable services. Otherwise, there would be no economic justice or advancement of those communities. Now, if you have to do that, and on the other side, you have to create the generation assets. So I think the subsidies should go into creating the generation assets and ensuring the delivery of electricity at affordable prices. Now that leaves out the distribution services. So it's the distribution services that has to be commercially viable. And therefore, what is the incentive for commercially viable distribution service? So let me give you an example. If, let's say, the generation assets are held by another organization which can hold 100 or put bundles of 100 Minigrid generation assets, and it promises to deliver electricity to a distribution service company at, let's say, 10 cents or 5 cents at the dispatch point, and that the community has to be serviced at 20 cents or whatever is the thing. See, if you can manage that, the distribution service has to be a commercially viable business. And I think we have to think in some ways as to which part of this equation is commercially viable and which part needs to be subsidized and managed. So I think that's what I would suggest. And I would suggest that there has to be good analysis of what's happening in the Minigrid sector in Africa with complete data transparency. Thank you.
Great. Brad, I wonder if you want to pick up on that, the notion that I think productive use or larger anchor loads or finding these customers that can be more reliable, either for higher amounts of power consumption or higher tariffs. How do you respond to the Jaideep's point of distribution has to be commercially viable on its own? Are we only going to get so far if we're thinking about an unviable distribution model that's reliant on PUE, productive use business model modifications to make the system work?
Yeah, I think JD brings up a big issue, and he was alluding to it several times where he was talking about what's going on here when you only have 20% utilization of your assets. Obviously, if you build a power system and you're only using it 20% of the time, it's very hard to make it sustainable. So this is just silly. But here's where we have to actually look at unintended consequences of an RBF. Because basically, if you're getting paid per connection, what you might do as a mini-grid developer is put in capacity, hook up hundreds and hundreds and hundreds or 1,000 sites, and then they may not have really any demand, but you get paid on the hookup. You don't get paid on the demand. And so what would that look like? Well, it would look like 20% utilization. It would look like you put all this stuff, but you're not utilizing it. So this is an unintended bad consequence of that. But if you're in it for the long haul, like as a developer, you would not play that game of taking advantage of subsidies, because then you're losing money when you're running your mini grid at a 20% utilization. That is not sustainable. So I posit that one of the problems in the sector really is the site selection process. Until you have a concession or you have some kind of subsidy in place that you can trust, you have to think from a commercial point of view. You have to have a sustainable business model. Then you really have to be careful how you pick your sites, that you can either the demand exists or you can generate the demand because there's enough economic activity in the village, there's enough need for electricity, there are enough, as Jonathan mentioned, productive uses that you could help convert, or you can go around and count and say, hey, this village has 200 diesel generators that we could replace. So whatever way you want to survey it or how you want to do your profile, we have personally a scorecard with algorithms in it, that we basically know when we go into a village with some degree of certainty that we'll be able to make a profit with it at that site. We'll be able to make a profit within 3 months. And so it's been tested over 8 years, so we keep on refining this in terms of how do you pick it so you actually know there will be some demand. So we're running at 60% utilization, not 20% utilization. Therefore, you can imagine it's a lot easier to make a profit if you have 60% utilization of your assets. So I think this site selection is very important. No one should be running their mini grids at 20%, and you got to be careful for unintended consequences of subsidies that might drive it in the other direction, that drive utilization and a lot of connections early on, regardless of whether you can service those or if there's enough demand to make them viable.
Great. Yeah. Mukabanji, is there anything you want to pick up on there? Are there programs that you've seen that maybe have design elements that have led to these unintended consequences? Or I imagine Engie is not thinking about or planning systems that ever run on 20% utilization, but I'm guessing you've probably seen or operated in environments where you've seen these types of grids. Are there elements in the design of programs that you connect to sort of these inefficient outcomes or unintended consequences?
Okay, so I'll echo the words of Brad. The key here is the actual site selection methodology. Of course, you want to get a site with an already existing entrepreneurial prevalence, because then you transform the customer base from being typical household connections to income generating activities that would then provide a service and would provide much of your needed revenue. Of course, if there are diesel generators already within the village, it would then show that you can provide a business case to transform them from a diesel source into a much cleaner source of electrification. So already that's a key methodology that usually misses. And with an RBF system, that would obviously promise to provide you a certain amount once you provide a connection. The easy way out is to really drop a service cable to everyone. But I think in the business models that we're looking at, Husk as well, and also the ones that we have within Engie, is that we realize that not everyone needs a service drop. Electrification is in all different sources, and no wonder within Engie we do have a specific value chain that then provides different access levels depending on the pocket, because electricity is not cheap. The tariffs that would actually be approved from the regulator's side, and also the ones that would provide some reasonable rate of return on your business model, are not the same as what you'd find on the central grid. So obviously you'd want to onboard customers who definitely do have a business and do have a need for the electrifications to be able to consume the much needed consumption outwards. Because then when you put it in that way, it sorts the demand risk that is usually a problem in most mini-grid setups. So I think going forward, the methodology has to be clear in terms of the site selection, but also aside from the site selection, you're already in the area. What then do you do to improve the economics in terms of how the consumption evolves beyond what you've already found? We find that partnerships and synergies with like-minded institutions that would otherwise provide the appliance financing to switch to much more efficient appliances would actually help in changing the dynamics around, but then also investing in capacity building, also coming in from the flagship of the different partners that you on board is really quite key, because then with the increased capacity, you can actually see productivity coming in from the different facets that most of our customers really run. You'd agree with me that most of our customers are typically agrarian. With climate change being an issue right now, you obviously want them to move towards climate smart practices in terms of how they bring in their revenue or their produce, and also adding much more productivity. That would then be a game changer. So in our case, for instance, productive use makes about 80 or 90% of the revenues that we receive from each mini-grid connection. So going forward, we definitely want to drop a service line to a customer that will be able to bring us that kind of revenue, because we're in a business. We have to make a commercial sense of this business. We want to get to a point that Brad has gotten to, a point where they're now EBITDA positive. So with the dynamics that are just plain, where you just get into a site just because you're going to get an RBA for each connection, it would not make sense for us to actually go there if we're actually thinking of getting towards a point of sustainability moving us to scalability for us to be able to attract additional investment.
Fantastic. We have about 10 minutes left on this panel, and I just pulled up the questions. We've got some interesting questions. I'm going to refer to that. So if there are further questions from the audience, please throw them on there. Picking up on Muka's point and an interesting question that's in the chat here on kind of climate smart practices and carbon markets. I asked this to anyone on the panel who has thoughts, but related to increasing demand, is there a way to link voluntary carbon markets in order to give users of mini grids credit for decreasing their emissions by adopting a mini grid model? Not sure how all of these initiatives are linked, or maybe even beyond that, maybe a way of bundling low carbon practices that are facilitated under a mini grid approach. I'm not sure. Is there anyone who has thoughts on that one?
Jonathan, I could take a stab at that. We've
Sure.
already applied for that and have carbon credits for what our mini grids do, but we just fold it into the tariff. So, it basically reduces our cost basis by getting the carbon credits, and then it goes into our calculations on what tariffs we charge. So it's not like a direct, credit to the our customers, but it is just through the tariff.
Yeah,
did I see your hand as well?
Yeah, I can just add and support what Brad just mentioned. So, Husk has been doing this, and this is a program that we had organized for 2 of our partners, and now we're expanding this program in India for monetizing the carbon credits that are available for the mini grid sector. It just adds to the viability, and like what Brad mentioned, it then gets folded into the tariff structure to provide, that's how the benefit is provided, and the business model has further incentives to do that. So yeah.
But in both of these cases, the carbon market entry was after mini grid is up and running, and the cash flows from the carbon market were not really used to figure out the design of the mini grid or the tariff that the mini grid would charge. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. It's a welcome bonus, post the mini grids performance and data availability. And data is extremely important to validating those carbon credits, etc. And that's why it's also important in Africa as you begin the market. There's potential for monetizing carbon credits, and GAP is working on creating a carbon market entity for that purpose. But what you need to do is verifiable data, credible data. And again, you have to sell the electrons that you produce from your assets. That's when you generate more of those credits. So that's extremely important for higher utilization of those assets.
Okay,
yeah, I'd
great.
argue that the carbon is helpful, but just as an order of magnitude, Jonathan, it's way down our list in terms of what we looked at. Site selection is key. Getting your utilization up over 50%, really important. And then one we haven't talked of here is ARPU. It's another measure of demand, but average revenue per user. Finding out ways to better service. A lot of times it's the small and medium-sized enterprises or micro enterprises that you help facilitate use of electricity, whether it be a mill or a welding shop or furniture shop, helping them finance to get, instead of hand saws, they could use a mill or so. We've seen customers have 200, 300, 400% revenue increase because, we basically electrify their processes. So finding out ways to do that, drive up your ARPU. That's giving your average revenue. So figuring out how to get high utilization, high ARPU is really key. And then carbon becomes, it's a positive effect, but secondary compared to those.
Great. So I think we've got about 6 minutes left. So we'll do a final 2 minutes or so from each speaker. I'll keep it general. How can market-based programs be improved? What are some strong or weak points that we haven't discussed yet? Anything that we want to put on the agenda for this conference to maybe continue to noodle on or reflect on in future gatherings? Any other lessons from the experience that you've had thus far that we should have on the table? Maybe we'll go in reverse order from the way we started. So start with you, Jaideep.
Yeah, thank you. So in summary, I would say, we're speaking of Minigrid, and I know Africa is the focus geography here. Just let me state upfront, there's a huge role for, public money and charitable money or donor money to make this, the dream of universal electrification a success. And mini grids are going to be an extremely important element of that solution. But, to make mini grids sustainable, viable, I think we have to go back a bit and start looking at a country level, in terms of what Ignacio referred to, integrated electricity planning or demand planning, and what solution would be the right fit. In the sense, where does the standalone go and where do the mini grids actually go, and where is the grid, and certain future prediction of how all this will integrate one day. And if you do that, then the developers, the donors and financiers have a place where they can focus on, and then figure out where the subsidy element goes, which part of the whole equation has to operate completely commercially, yet you have the tariff for the community or the service, that cannot be unfair, and that has to match the regulatory or about the regulatory tariff that are there, which other grid customers are getting. So addressing that makes, in the context of an integrated planning, gives a proper direction where the mini grids can develop and become sustainable, and which elements of the mini grid needs to operate commercially while having the guardrails on both sides in terms of generation, subsidized, and the tariff. The end user gets subsidized, by the distribution services have to operate commercially. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jaideep. Brad.
Yeah, I just want to, I'd basically say I want to encourage everyone to read the paper Ignacio sent out. A big fan of all his work. I think I'm perfectly aligned with everything in there, all the recommendations. And so I can't add too much. I think that job was so well done. I can't add too much to it. But I'd say from a developer's perspective, and I'm a board member at AMDA, don't let us off the hook. We could be doing things to make things easier as well. And we do things we should be doing. For example, Huskies, we're under 30 cents per kilowatt hour for cost of LCOE of electricity. And a lot of companies aren't. We can be pushing ourselves to get better and reduce it, make it easier from a tariff point of view. And as we talked earlier, move up our utilization factors. We could do a better job. So don't let us off the hook. I think we need to have more focus in the sector. Of course, we should focus on regulators. We should focus on the funders and donors. We have things we can improve there, but don't lose focus on the developers. We have things we can do better too.
Great final message, Brad. Thank you. Mukabanji, over to you.
Thank you. So electrification is a key priority for every African country across. And the solution lies in how intentional and deliberate we are at a policy level, and also ensuring that we're very optimized in the way we do our holistic planning. Like Jaideep actually mentioned, we have to be very comprehensive and holistic around how the integrated planning would be, and how optimized the subsidies could be taken on the on-grid, off-grid side as well. But also the structure of the financing available, as well as the regulation, should be structured in such a way that it speaks to the peculiarities of this very difficult market, I submit. Thank you.
Fantastic. Excellent job by all of our panelists. Thank you all. So I'm going to throw it back to you, Ignacio. I think, did you want to have another 5 or 10-minute break here, or how's the program look?
Yes, in the program we have a break now, and continuing at 6 p.m. Central African time. So in 5 minutes again. Yeah.
Perfect. All right, we'll see you soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Right.
Thank you, Jonathan. You are on again in 5 minutes.
Africa must transition to an energy model that is inclusive, enables industrialization and development, and contributes to the common universal goal of fighting climate change.
A number of barriers exist that prevent African countries from using the abundant energy resources available on the continent in an environmentally friendly way and in a manner that will promote inclusive growth and development. These barriers include the lack of regulations, the lack of institutions to design and implement the regulations, and the lack of a critical mass of professionals to manage the energy sector. It is precisely to address these challenges that the initiative has been launched to establish an African School of Regulation.
The combination of the viewpoints of engineering, economics, and law is vital to address these challenges. In response to these needs, a partnership of leading institutions deeply involved in the African energy sector and the global clean energy transition has launched the African School of Regulation initiative.
The African School of Regulation, the ASR, aims to be a center of excellence for education, applied research, independent discussion, and knowledge exchange, with the purpose of improving the quality of African energy regulation and policy.
In Africa, run by Africans and for Africa. The African School of Regulation will provide inclusive education designed by academics and practitioners to meet African professional needs, opportunities to share best practices and discuss freely present issues in African energy regulation, research for solutions to challenging current problems in energy regulatory practice, and a repository of indispensable and diverse resources. Join our efforts for a sustainable, reliable, and affordable energy in Africa.
¿Sí?
So I think Ignacio is trying to make sure Jose is online. So I was waiting for him to gavel us back into session, but why don't we just get started? Welcome back. You're stuck with me for another, oh, there he is. Did you want to open us up, Ignacio?
Well, I had a phone call from Jose Guerra, who is one of the speakers, and he is in Madagascar, in Tananarivo, and the electricity has had a disruption 15 minutes ago. So he was following the session, but he's now disconnected. So so he will try to join if the electricity, well, he will join if the electricity comes back. But for the time being, we have only you and two other panelists. So
okay.
In any moment, I could say something about premium grids if necessary. So I will be ready.
Okay. Part of doing business when it comes to energy access and access challenge places, no problem. So so we have about 55 minutes here. Hopefully Jose can join us. If not, I know we'll have a great discussion nonetheless. The topic here is concession-like mini-grid business models. And maybe first off, before we get too far down this road, why don't we fully define what it is we mean by concession? So I'm just going to throw up, let's see, how do I share here? Just the definition that was in the white paper that I thought was an excellent working definition. Here we are. Sorry. All right, are we all seeing this? Oops. Got too many windows open.
Mm-hmm.
All right, what is a concession? A concession to develop mini-grids is an agreement in which a firm, the concessionaire, obtains from the government of the host country the right to supply electricity under the conditions that are specified in a contract. These conditions include the period, 20 years is a typical figure, the right to sell and distribute electricity in the concession area with specific exclusivity rights, termination of the agreement, and the right to be beneficiary of the viability gap funding. All these conditions are generally described in great detail in the contract, which, if properly written, provides strong legal security to the concessionaire. So I think this approach answers some key questions in advance, right? Where is a mini grid going to be deployed? Who is it serving? What are some wraparound services that might be included in it? What's the grid integration plan, if there is one? In this type of strong government-led siting can support equity and other socially valued objectives by steering mini grid to development to last mile communities or important public facilities like health centers and schools. And it integrates competition and price discovery on the front end. So bidders can independently assess the cost of service under the concession offer, put forward what they think they can meet, and the award flows based on competitive bids. So why don't countries and donors ditch the market-based approaches and make everything a concession? I think there's lots to unpack there, and we'll have the panelists to talk about that. But two issues that I want to maybe mention before we open it up. One is just simply workability, right? These are big, complicated contracts applied to what is a very new sector in most countries, right? So it can be very, very challenging for a company with a winning concession bid to implement perhaps at the cost that they said they could, right? And that could put a government in the position of having to renegotiate concession contracts, which is a troubling precedent that no governments really want to be in. So how can concessions avoid the sort of slow and bureaucratic processes that we've seen drive on in many countries? And then related to that, I think, is this notion of building local capacity. A couple of years ago, I did a deep dive into 20 different African mini-grid programs, the design of them. The majority of them have clear objectives around building a robust local sector. And many have screening criteria to favor local developers over international companies. And these goals can really be part of what a just transition means for many countries. But the reality is that a complicated concession process can be particularly hard for small local developers that may have limited experience executing these types of projects, and maybe lack the financial cushion to engage what, think about that chart that Jessica showed at the beginning, how long some of these periods could take in the regulatory process. So how are we going to balance competitiveness and the desire to deliver at low cost with the fact that we're still in the early stages of this hopefully growing sector that needs time and investment and experience really to reach a certain level of performance? So I am going to stop the provocation there and invite our panelists to tell us briefly about where their organization fits in this electrification or mini-grid ecosystem, and what your experience has been working on concession approaches in particular. What have the results been this far? So we're going to start with Irene Calve, CEO and co-founder of Sankofa Energy, a mini-grid startup focusing on development and operations with projects in Benin, Zambia, and Mozambique. She is also a veteran of Engie Power Corner. Thanks for being with us, Irene.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. So I think you put it in a very nice and sweet way. So basically, my background is on the development of mini-grids. I first worked for Engie, so a big utility trying to develop mini-grids. And then I created with some colleagues my own company for developing and operating mini-grids, which is Sankofa Energy. So on that side, we are trying to develop mini-grid projects. And on the top of that, we are also providing consulting services for usually projects related to the definition of regulatory frameworks for energy access and specifically for mini-grids. So I get like a double hat on this one. And I don't know, maybe we finish the introduction and then we go into the topic, or you rather prefer me to do it now?
You could give us a little bit of opening on maybe concessions in particular, yeah, and how Sankofa has played in them.
Yeah, sure. So from my point of view, concessions are necessary. So it's not a matter of is it the better way or not. I do not imagine how can this sector move forward without concessions. But on the other hand, I fully agree with you how to make this process not so cumbersome, and especially for developers. Because there's one of the elements here that we often forget, which is the money. So basically, developers are developing the project, but they less and less the ones providing the total amount of the investment. We need to raise debt, we need to raise equity. And our criteria as developers or our needs are not always the same, obviously, that the ones of the investors. So in this concession negotiation, so in the concession contract negotiation is a really hard one, because you are not only negotiating on your behalf, but you are also negotiating on behalf of your investors. And sometimes the timeline doesn't align, meaning that sometimes you still don't know who is going to be the final investor. Or for example, you have an idea for the equity, but not for the debt. Or you can find yourself negotiating on behalf of what would you expect that the investor is going to want. So that's something that wasn't mentioned at the beginning that I think is really important, because it happens, and I think I've been complaining for this for a while, so sorry for that. But it happens very often that we are just a middleman in the middle of everyone, like the requirements of the investors, of the DFIs, of the authorities through the concession contract. And that's something that has to be solved. So it's not only a problem of bureaucracy, but also a problem of having the right people at the right time around the table.
Excellent. Thanks for the opening there, Irene. Let's move to our next panelist, Divyam Nagpal. Good to see you again, Divyam. Divyam is the Program Officer for Energy Access Knowledge and Policy and Finance Center at IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency. Over to you, Divyam.
Thanks, Jonathan, and good to see you as well. So I think on the issue of concessions, probably pick up where Irene started. I think there is probably no other way to get to universal access and achieve the dream that we laid out. Household, farm, clinic, school. The only way to do that is through pushing the private sector, pushing the different stakeholders to. Can you hear me all right, Jonathan?
You're coming and going. The microphone might be having some problems.
Okay, just give me a second. Is that better?
Yes, that is better.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Perfect. So yeah, so I think, if we have to make sure that we leave nobody behind, we have to make sure that everybody gets electrified to a certain level of electricity service. Then, and we have to make sure that the sector scales to the true potential. Concessions is probably the direction that we go to. Market.
So Divyam, it's spotty again. At least on my end, you're coming and going.
Maybe I'll turn off my video and let's try that.
Okay.
Does that work better?
I wonder if it does sound like the microphone's a little muffled. Is it possible to get it closer, or does the laptop have a microphone?
Is that better?
Yes.
Looks like that, yep.
Okay, let's try this. So yeah, so I think in the end, I think concessions will probably be the way to go in sort of scaling up mini grids to the level that they need to go. I think on the sort of market-based approaches, they have their own place. I think a lot of the innovation, a lot of the private sector development, a lot of the financing, the sector maturity has come from that space. But I think the real risk is really that a lot of the public financing and the instruments that are being designed right now are catering to that segment of the market segment for mini grids, because public financing for concessions will have to be tailored very differently to public financing as it is being done for market-based approaches. So just maybe a few initial points to mention here. I think Irene already spoke about the need for lowering transaction costs, the need for strong legal and institutional governance frameworks, so we make sure that the contracts are backed by institutions that can deliver them. I think the important point here really is to emphasize on a cost of service approach, because if the concessionaire is going to be hand-holding the communities and delivering services, investing in assets over a period of time, they have to have the surety that they will be able to cover those costs, whether through tariffs or through a viability gap funding that is upfront or it's ongoing, which is probably a more important look at. And do we have the public financing that's lined up to be able to support this process over a period of time as the communities go through the demand process? I think just another point to mention here is on information asymmetry. I think a lot of, on the bidding side, a lot of the data that is required for mini grids in terms of citing existing demand profiles, communities, where the grid is. If you don't have the right information, then the bidding process and the assumptions that developers make in terms of applying for those concessions, then those sort of come to fault. But also then de-risking on the operational side. If demand does not grow at the same level, how do you sort of provide the support to the concessionaire and provide the minimum revenue guarantees or indexations to protect them in this environment? And maybe just a final point to say is, we have very many different modes of electrification. Mini grids is one of them. There are standalone systems. Maybe in certain concession areas, you need a mix of approaches other than one single approach. So do we really need to move towards a technology concession or mini grid concession? Or do we need a service-oriented concession where basically the concessionaire can see as, over a period of time, what solution fits best? And then as demand evolves, sort of play around with that and support that kind of an. I'll pause here and then, give the floor back.
Great, thanks, Divyam. Ignacio, you gave us your opening statement in this excellent white paper, but anything you want to fill in there? Any other issues you want to put on the table out of the gate?
Well, a couple of comments. One is that if we are really looking for sustainability and scalability, in this roadmap that that Brad Matson was talking about in the previous panel, they talk about scalability. I mean, if they talk about 200,000 mini grids in Africa, they are talking about the need to have 10 large companies building 2,000 mini grids per year. So, I mean, these companies could really handle concession contracts and all the red tape because they are large. So it is not a question of multiplying the capacity of the existing companies by 1.5 or 2. It's multiplying it by 20. Otherwise, I mean, it's a dream. This is really a dream to think of Sustainable Development Goal 7 by 2030. This is one thing. I fully agree with Irene and Divyam about the necessity to have some kind of contract, a concession, a sub-franchise of some kind to provide legal security to the investors and the developers. And the reason I invited Jose Guerra, who is missing, but by the way, they have tomorrow morning a presentation of their model, premium grids, to the government of Nigeria, and I've been invited to give the keynote speech. So I will put in our website the link if people want in the morning to listen to that in the morning here in Central Africa or Europe. They are very welcome to join, and they will have a full explanation of what the model is. So the model, what it is in Nigeria, which is a very important, a very difficult country from the viewpoint of provision of electricity, to take an area where the disco is, I would say, all the discos in Nigeria is not working properly, providing very poor service, and to carve out an area in which they could have a mix of people that have already electricity, they have connection, but very good, poor quality or reliability, and carve out an area, obtain a sub-franchise contract, so it's a kind of concession for 20 years, and provide local embedded generation, improve the wires, get a revenue requirement from the regulator, and arrange some cross-subsidization internal, so it is viable. So they can prove, by doing that repeatedly in different places in the country, can prove that it is possible in Nigeria to provide service of good quality at prices that people can afford. And this is what they call the premium grids model. Again, a type of concession, a very special one, different from the model that Jaideep has presented before, different from a more classical concession arrangement, as Irene probably will tell us in a moment, but a concession, a sub-franchise that is landing in an area where there is already service, but very poor quality. And they use the wires of the disco. They take over all the distribution wires part of the business and the commercial part, and they are the small distributor in that area with good quality.
Okay, so let's pick up on Irene. Maybe I can steer this one to you. You know, we have this vision of 200,000 mini grids, 10 large companies operating at a scale that currently no one is operating at. And we've got this opportunity of concessions, and I'm wondering how we think about scale in these concessions and maybe how big these are. Maybe we can go back to you, Ignacio, to maybe give us an example of how big these concessions are. But how do we think about this limited amount of regulatory bandwidth and the scale that's needed And really, how big can a concession be if we're going to get the participation of a broad, what's currently a very small sector right now in terms of experience and number of companies?
Thank you, Jonathan. So what I think, first of all, I was thinking while all of you were talking, that sometimes wording can be tricky. Just this morning, we were discussing on a regulatory framework for mini-grids in Angola. And at some point, we realized we were not understanding each other with a different person because I was using the word concession, she was using the word license, and both of us were referring to the same side. So I really appreciated that you showed at the beginning the definition of concession, because sometimes wording can be extremely tricky and people tend to reduce one word to just one idea, and see if you diverge from that, I think we are discussing about something else. So that's a point I wanted to make. In my case of a concession, what I think we forget is the learning effect we have from one concession. When you are the first one in a country in which this is the first, 100 mini-grids that are developed in a country under a concession model, of course, is a very extremely time-consuming process, let's be honest. And to be honest, I don't know how to compress that timing. I don't even think it's compressible, because on the side of the developers, we need to check that everything is fine. On the side of the counterpart of the concession, which probably should be the regulator or the Agency of Rural Electrification, they also need to understand what is the company presenting, what they intend to do, etc. So, and then the negotiation process, in which you need to take account so many things. So I cannot imagine how to reduce that much. Of course, we can have standardized templates. Of course, we can have a lot of things, but there will still be a long period of negotiation in front of us. The good thing, and when we talk about scalability, that's where I think that the learning effect can be very important. For example, I'm developing, 10 mini-grids in a certain country under a concession agreement. When I will install the next 20, the next 40, or the next whatever, my counterpart already knows what I'm looking for. There's already a personal relationship. There's already everything on the table. So the time will be compressed at an incredible scale. So when we talk about support, I think that most of the support, and when I say support, is not only about money, but also about technical assistance, about capacity building, that has to be concentrated on the first concessions contract. And then from that, learning. Another thing that could be useful for concession is to try to extrapolate learnings during the capacity building process, to try to extrapolate learnings from other sectors. Again, coming back to the case of Angola, we have already concessions for oil fields. Let's try to, based on that, not to use the same regulation, but when we need to understand each other, from a developer to a person sitting on the regulator, for example, it's really easier to be based on things they already know. So that could be also ideas. So for the scalability, I'm not that afraid. I'm very scared about the first one having to go through all the process, which is really complicated. And that's where I think that, for example, the structuration of a grant agreement, when we are talking about grants on a milestone base, on a result finance base, this has to be pre-financed in any way, because otherwise, as a developer, you can get stuck for 2 years, for 3 years, negotiating a concession contract without any income. And that is really a struggle and a problem for developers. So that's something that has to be avoided.
Great. Some really good points there on front-loading TA on first concessions and learning from other sectors too. Ignacio, do you want to maybe give us a little bit more color on the Nigeria example? And I don't know, was that, did that experience, or is that experience leaning on the oil and gas sector at all for concessions, or previous, concessions to distribution companies that happened years ago?
Well, this is an experiment. They have been working with the GIZ group and some funding from the European Commission in a project, NESP Second, I think is the name. And what they have done is to get business ready for some investors to take. So the role of this Jose Guerra and his company, or the project that they have been developing, is to identify several sites, several territories where that approach could be available, could be possible, and to do all the technical and financial work to get that ready for some investors to come and make an arrangement with the government of Nigeria and the DISCO. Something that happens is that the regulation in Nigeria is extremely flexible and allows all these kinds of innovative approaches and sub-franchises that could take different forms, to deploy some embedded generation that could negotiate using the wires of others, could negotiate businesses with different types of customers, etc., etc. So they are taking advantage of that flexible regulation to do this. Something that, I mean, I don't think that there is much experience in concessions for mini-grids. There are more experiences in concessions for distribution. The ASR, the first activity that we did in March 2022, was a 3-day virtual conference on concessions for DISCOs, for distribution. And we have all the material available in our website. And it is very clear that the way of turning a bankrupt distribution company is basically except for one or two, distribution companies of Sub-Saharan Africa they are losing money permanently. To turn that into a viable business is a concession agreement. It's the same thing as a losing bank that you could split into the bad bank and the good one. So you could sign an agreement with some, consortium, some entity to take care, as it was said in the definition that you read before, to take over the investment, operation, maintenance, etc., of this business for a price. And if there is an agreement, is that the price is correct, and therefore the business is viable. And of course, there will be the losing part. Okay, the government will have to take care of that, but at least there will be a company that is doing that professionally and making money by doing this, and with certain conditions of quality of service, a number of connections, etc., etc. So the idea is to extend that to the world of mini-grids.
Great. Irene, I see you have your hand up there. Jump in.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. It's just that I realized that I forget, because I said, okay, I think concessions are necessary, but I didn't say why compared to a licensing process. I think because you were mentioning that this is a new market, mini-grids, and let's be honest, for the moment, still new. We still haven't figured that out. And what I think is really good about concessions is the fact that instead of having a law and that law just drops onto you, you have most of the important topics for an investor in mini-grids that are discussed in a bilateral way. That means we learn from each other, we learn the problems or the reason why. I need a protection if the main grid arrives. I need this and this other. Or for example, when we talk only about tariff, not only about the definition of tariff, but also, is it going to be reviewed? How is it going to be renewed? How many days before a review? All these kind of things can be discussed bilaterally and reach an agreement. And I think that is essential if we want to ensure the necessary capacity building to understand each other in this sector. And also it is essential if we want to have a bulletproof contract in which we can use for raising funds.
Excellent. Well, I see Jose has joined us, and it wouldn't be a real energy access conversation if we didn't have some access challenges. So glad you've joined us. Ignacio did introduce premium grids and sort of the project a little bit happening in Nigeria, but Jose, would love to pull you in here. Maybe you can give us a little bit of background on the concession model that you're working on in Madagascar, or other sort of opening points you'd like to share.
Okay, well, first, apologies. As you said, I'm in Antananarivo, and I don't know what happened. Like, the weather is not very good, and suddenly lights and Wi-Fi and internet in the country disappeared for half an hour, and precisely it was by the time that I had to participate in this. So apologies once more. So I'm actually in Madagascar working on a proposal of the electrification in rural areas. So Minigrid is part of the solution. But as Ignacio said, when you look at large territories, Minigrid is not the only solution. It becomes like a pool of different things, right? And particularly here in Madagascar, we still have to extend the network as a first resource, I would say like a long-term resource. If possible, then we also need to look at the mini-grids, and of course we need to integrate a standalone systems, because the electrification rate here is really, really low. So also I would like to introduce a little bit myself. I'm coming up from the mini-grid sector, so I'm coming from more than 25 years working in the utility in sector. So my background is more like a distribution expert than a mini-grid expert. So saying this, and I've been listening to Ignacio and the other speakers before, not my dear panelist, but my perspective, it is in Africa, it is that still the on-grid electricity sector, in particular the distribution business, has a lot of challenges. And many times I see that we're doing things to fulfill the errors that we have in the distribution system. So very often, and how we reach, for instance, to premium grids, which is a concessional model that has been designed, it didn't came naturally. It came as a failure of the distribution grid system, the whole on-grid system, but in particular the distribution one. And when I'm saying that, I'm referring to everything, the private, in this case in Nigeria, private operator, plus the whole ecosystem for regulation and policy failed, in my opinion. So in the case of Nigeria, there was a big privatization back in 2013. So that was in a way a concession and privatization. So you bring into the equation some private developers that they were supposed to solve many of the challenges that the system had. But within years and years, one and the other, and when I'm saying one, the private investors through the discos, and also the regulated fail on the duties, right? So with years, like we still like pre-Nigeria pumping around 6 trillion US dollars in just a few years of subsidies to the sector, but nothing changed. You know, like the lack of power keeps being endemic. The reliability of the transmission and distribution systems are really, really poor. So at the end, you have some customers which are still using large captive generation, and I'm particularly someone say that before, like very often in Africa you compete with diesel generators. Is that there is no electricity. You might have electricity, and you're competing with diesel generators through any solution, on conventional on-grid solutions or mini-grid or standalone systems. So I think that's one of the other keys that it was mentioned. So regarding to the concessional, what we're doing now is looking at sub-concessional model, where we're trying to bring a new solution, which is bringing power. So we are building large units of embedded generation of around 50 to 80 megawatt. So it's much more than a mini grid, it's much bigger. But we are supplying very large customers in industrial clusters, plus all the surroundings, plus all the residential, very low income families, which are always around those industrial clusters in Nigeria. Yeah. So we are coming with areas of small cities in Europe, like 30 to 50,000 connection. So it's in terms of a scale, it's much bigger than a mini grid. But in terms of two things, we're looking for profitable projects. We're not looking for subsidies or any concessional funding. We were looking for projects where you can build those areas. And again, this is when I say that is the failure of the system, because from a conventional perspective, those areas should be the first ones to be developed by any private distributor. But as the system fail, there is no, they cannot invest on those areas because they don't have access to funding. Plus, if you look at the tariff that those areas have, they will not be cost reflective, sorry. So that would impede any possibility of investment in those areas. So we're looking for that. So just to mention that, as I always say, like mini-grids is part of the solution, but we have to keep an eye open on everything. Mini cannot be the solution for a failed in the system. And when I say for the conventional one, that's for me important. And again, when you look at an electrification plan, you also need to think like in the long run, when the mini grid is going to be connected by a major operator, but it's a large distribution. And I think like that perspective of the long-term run, where you will have a utility which is coming to the area, that's very important. So those things.
Very interesting. Thanks, Jose. Divyam, I see you have your hand up. Jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Nigeria case is an interesting one, especially for a concession within the distribution concession area in itself. And I'm curious to know, what role does the utility play here? Does the utility just seek revenue from the use of the distribution network that is being used? Or is there a more stronger role that the utilities the distribution companies can play here by developing an SPV and participating in that sort of venture, but really getting another developer to attract the capital into new generation assets, etc. I don't know if that would be interesting to also hear on Nigeria experience.
So the discourse in Nigeria, for mini-grids in particular, for concessional models. So the first answer to mini-grids, in Nigeria, you have the two systems. One is what they call the off-grid mini-grids, where essentially discourse, they have no role there. It's the Rural Electrification Agency who is playing the game there. But then you have the interconnected mini-grids, which are in underdeveloped areas where the disco is eventually supplying epileptic power, barely like a few hours per week in many occasions. But yet there is a final DT, distribution transformer there, and is connected for whatever reason it was decided to be connected a long time ago. So for those areas of interconnection or interconnected mini-grids, the DISCO has a role. They need to agree on the concession of the area through a bilateral contract. So the community, the mini-grid and the DISCO, they need to agree that this area is going to be sub-concession for 10 years, 15 years, whatever is in the agreement. So that's one. For the concession of larger scale models like premium grids, the DISCO has a key role. I mean, it's like they need to sign a franchise agreement with the developer. So so it's a way of sub-concessioning something that they have in the right with the different agencies, with the BP and so on. So those are the two cases. So yes, DISCOs, and that's part of the challenge, yet DISCOs they want to keep for themselves parts of the territory. So one way or the other, it's very difficult to work with them and engage them and saying like, this is even good for your business. I mean, you cannot control your whole territory. So you need to find a way of concessioning areas for investment. And you're going to be here in 30, 40, 50 years. So if someone is going to retain those areas in 15 years, back to you in a much better performance, improve areas, well, take it, do it, because you don't have the resources now, and it's going to take you a while until you really get those areas back. Or you make those areas into the performance that you need. Yeah, so that's but my experience is that In some cases, this is believing or not believing. I don't believe in that. I will not do that. You know, they're radical on that idea. They will not follow the criteria. However, others, they started to understand that this is good for even for ATC&C losses, aggregate technical, commercial, and collection losses. If you have a rural area where you're barely collecting 40%, it's better to give it to someone. You know, like perhaps they collect more. What is important for the utility, for the disco, is that you will have a bulk meter, and then you start reducing all the losses that you have. You stop having collection losses or commercial losses at that point. Yeah, so it's a challenge, but we saw 3 utilities now in Nigeria, which are going forward of the 11th. And again here, the problem in Nigeria, in my opinion, is that the instability of the system, of the whole energy supply system, where you have the management of the discos is changing quite often. It's not even like today you have but they're failing because the whole perspective of sustainability of the system is simply not there. Things are not improving, and you eventually see some franchises as Conexa, which is, yes, finally starting to do, but it took them like 4 or 5 years to start with one concessional model.
Yeah. Irene, I see you have your hand up. Jump in.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to react to something that Jose said about the need for subsidies, but also the fact that mini-grids cannot be a solution for failures of other markets or other technologies or the way it's structured. And I couldn't agree more about that. I think we sometimes get lost of the sight of the final objective, which is SDG 7, and how concessions can ensure SDG 7. And that's something that in the case of mini-grids, because there are all these models, and you just mentioned about that, the need of 200,000 mini-grids. Yeah, but how are we going to build that? And concession is just a part of the solution. And that has also to be realistic. At the end of the day, the mini-grid, a concession, as I said before, only allow us to have a direct bilateral contract with the off-taker, which is a necessary condition, but not sufficient for the development of all the mini-grids. For example, what Jose mentioned, at the end of the day, you need to put mini-grids where they are the least cost solution, which seems obvious, but that there is a viability gap issue that I guess will be discussed in further panels. But from my point of view, that's a different whole topic that needs to be addressed. So yes, concessions are important and necessary, but with only that, I'm 100% sure that is not going to be enough for reaching SDG 7, clearly not.
Yeah. And just to complement, perhaps you mentioned that, something that I want to emphasize, because Ignacio mentioned that at the beginning, it's the holistic view of the prices, the revenue model that you need to put in. It has we're going through mini grids, yeah, and you also mentioned that the least cost strategy, but it's unclear when you have subsidies on one side and you don't have subsidies on the other. In the case of Nigeria, we're talking like you don't really have the clue of what is best, yeah, because sometimes you have subsidies, sometimes you don't. Sometimes when you are on grid, you have a cap on the tariff because the regulator has political risks, let's say, or governance is unclear, and then you have like a limit on what is the price of the on-grid electricity. So it can be 55 nairas per kilowatt hour, and then you go to the off-grid mini grids, and then you can find 200. And then you're trying to build an strategy where you say, well, I can be 200 even with subsidies, but on the on-grid that I cannot go more than 60 because it's a regulated activity. And in the long run, if I want to electrify, maybe electrification through the on-grid it can be done at 100 nairas, but yet I'm not allowed to do it because there is a political intervention on this. So, however, if you want to connect that area to 100, then you can connect it because there you don't have a restriction on prices. Yeah. So I'll always, and I think like the African School of Regulation has a lot to do in Africa, because I think we need to think on all these at the same time. Like there is no one solution. There is electrification, as it were, or universal access. There is no mini grids. There are no standalone system. There's conventional grids. In the long run, we all think that we want people to be connected with the most reliable source of electrification possible, and the most affordable. That's the other thing. But we're also, it is true that we're competing with diesel, and even you need to bring into the equation all the sources which are not electricity. So if you go to the market and you see that there is subsidies in diesel or gasoline, then you're also saying like what I'm doing, so you really need to have a full holistic energy policy, which is not only about electricity, it's about all the resources.
I couldn't agree more with that, and I think it's a huge problem. And the problem is that there is no, at least from my point of view, there is a lack of a planning authority that goes above all of that. Because there is always money in the middle that comes from one source or another, or someone that has a great idea, and then let's try to implement this piece of model for this specific technology or for this specific region. And then this part will get it to the market, and then the other part. And there's no like a broader approach in which you plan accordingly to least cost electrifying the whole country or the whole territory, and then drop down, and then let's see how it goes. But I couldn't agree more with you. For me, there is a huge issue on that. And look at today in the African continent, there are so many electricity markets being developed. But at the same time, we know a huge part is going to be done via off-grid. Then what is the correlation between those two? It doesn't even exist. So I fully agree with you that that is a problem that needs to be solved. And again, concessions here as a part of the solution, but the problem is broader than that.
Yeah, and I think this is part of Ignacio's point in the white paper, that this higher level vision, whether it's a formal authority or a unified vision of what the sector in a country is going to look like, has to kind of have a buy-in and be fleshed out for these to be workable. I wanted to go back quickly. We're a bit short on time, but Divyam, you mentioned in your opening a couple of things I wanted to maybe pull on a little bit more and maybe get the group's input on. We have other actors here who would like to be supportive, and research organizations, IRENA, many others, and including folks on this call. You pointed out, information asymmetries, de-risking the operational side. I think you're talking about like sort of understanding the productive use opportunity and the demand side a little better. Those sound like they could be calls to the broader ecosystem of actors, researchers, whoever. Those are also things that companies do. How do you look at this in terms of division of labor? What's the role of some actors besides developers, investors, and regulators to kind of support here?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two parts to it. One is that, if you are going to sort of create some sort of a competitive framework, or even if you're having negotiations with governments, it probably helps to have data on its, cost, but also on the sites themselves. And a lot of that has to be funded, in my opinion, through public money, because that's sort of a lot of the market support action that needs to be done. And that should be part of the package as you design the concessions and all of that, right? It also limits the risks on the concessionaire at the later part of, once they're in it and once they're operating, there are no surprises at that point, which leads to sort of friction down the road. So I think there's a big role for sort of non-developers and other institutions to kind of gather that data, put it together, make it accessible, where the loads are, where the productive loads are, what are the demand profiles, how does the demand evolve across mini-grid profiles, so that, developers themselves can use. And I think that's something that's going to play a big role moving forward, yeah.
Great. Irene, jump in there.
I just wanted to say, because I think I played on different sides on everything related to mini-grid. So at the beginning of my career, I was also like trying in a center of expertise, thinking about the optimization, how to make it better, demand side management, all these things. The problem for the moment is that we struggle, we mini-grid developers, so much with what the simplest version of a mini grid, like just produce and sell electricity, try to raise money. Just with that, you see how much money has been committed and not deployed to mini grids. That's the reason. So sometimes I feel there is a huge gap between academia and all these institutions that are thinking, which is fascinating and I love it, but are thinking at maybe 10 years from now, like, okay, how will demand side management? I remember we designed, for me it's an anecdote, but I think it's quite representative. We designed a software that was optimizing exactly the size of a mini grid, how many panels, etc. And then the technical person told me, yes, Irene, that's great, but the thing is that I have this kind of container or this kind of container, so I can send either 20, either 40, but there's not 56.8 megawatt. So you know what I mean? And that is, I feel that is kind of happening. All these ideas are great, but for the moment, the problem is even simpler than that. Is how do we make sure that the committed money is being deployed for mini grids?
Well, we covered a lot of ground here. I'm going to give everyone sort of the final minute. You know, there were some prompts that we didn't get to. What are critical elements of concessions that must be specified? Maybe someone wants to go through their tick button list, but this is also an opportunity, I think, to lay out other agenda items that we can focus on in later discussions or later gatherings. So maybe we'll go in reverse order, which I think means Jose is up, and then we'll go Divyam, and then Irene. You're on mute, Jose.
Apologies. For concessional models, like one piece of the puzzle, which is going to, like in every business, is going to be the contract. It has to be clear, as clear in the sense that duties and responsibilities of the different stakeholders are crystal clear. Everyone has an absolute clarity on their mandate, and even if thinking in 20 years, like when you're going to return the assets back to an operator, yeah, how is it going to be done? What is the marginal value or the residual value of the assets? How is it going to be paid during the transactions, which are the duos that you're going, the distributions, use of systems that you're going to pay to the operator, and so on. So that's number one. Like in any contract, in any business, a contract is a key part of the equation. The other one, before you sign anything, you really need to have a clear understanding of what's going on in the area. And perhaps in a mini grid it's easier, you know, like because the area, the size is different. In a larger project of a premium grid, that is key. I mean, like from distribution, even from the on-grid business, you have an idea. Yeah, but when you do the field analysis, then you discover that 99% of the large industrial clusters, they're using captive generation. They're burning heavy fuel oil, or they're burning, and you don't control that. You don't have visibility on this. So you don't know how many hours they're running. They're huge generators. We're talking about 2 to 5 megas each. And suddenly, like you found that the project looks terribly different. So understanding the business at the very beginning, it's going to be key. And secondly, that you also need to forecast that the business as today is something, but the evolution might be something different. And this is where you need to really have, like, to tune your investments according to your projections and to be as accurate as possible. And you need to be flexible also to reality. Suddenly we have a COVID in the middle, and plans change, you know, and then you're required to have some flexibilities. You know? So all these things are going to be, so the baseline key, and the contract for me, it's the concessional contract is another very important piece of the puzzle.
Great. Thanks, Jose. Divyam.
Yeah, just picking up on that, I think something that would be key is, as everybody sort of goes through the different experiences with the negotiations on the concession contract, the design, what sort of goes into it, I think it might be interesting to, at least at our level, you know, have a little bit of more knowledge exchange between the regulators themselves. We've had a few regulators come to us who said, oh, we've already had this regulation installed, it's passed, but we just don't know how to implement it, or we need capacity to sort of deploy this particular part of the regulation. So I think that knowledge exchange would be important. A second point, I think, on public financing and how do you structure public financing for concessions. So for instance, as Irina mentioned, around TA, pre-financing, and making that very clear from the beginning that stakeholders have access to that. And thirdly, around sort of integrated plans. Now there's a lot of money that's going into integrated energy access plans, electrification plans. How do we kind of bring in the holistic thinking perspectives that we've spoken about in this panel, and integrate it with the financing, investments, and all the way down to implementation? Those will be the key priority.
Yeah, I think we could have a whole separate conversation about how to structure public financing for concessions. So hopefully next time. Irene, over to you. Last word.
Yeah.
Unless Ignacio wants the last word. Sorry.
I'm going to keep it super short because I see the time. So just build on what Jose said. Pardon my language, but shit happens. So concession contracts had to ensure all the review mechanism for tariff, for grid arrival, for everything. Not the answer, but how it will be tackled. And that's essential. And second, that as a developer, I need to put on the table the application. Because sometimes there's something written and then how it's applied might differ a lot for what was written in the contract. So also during the negotiation has to be put up front also.
Great. Well, we've got a good agenda here, and what a rich discussion. Thank you, everyone, for participating and for sharing your insights. Ignacio, I think we're a couple minutes over, but it was worth it, right? Over to you.
Oh, yes. I mean, you have done a good, excellent job in navigating these two different worlds of these two approaches to mini grids. I think that in the first one, we have seen that there is room for developers to do things, to find business with a lot of struggle, as Irene has been saying, but it is possible. But that is cannot be inclusive, is only the low-hanging fruit or the middle high hanging fruit, but not the one at the top. And for that, we need, stronger instruments. And this is what we have been discussing in this second part. Concessions, I think that the three speakers have agreed that are indispensable to make large-scale progress. So I think that tomorrow we have a great day in which we are going to look at how maybe these two worlds could reconcile these two viewpoints and to make progress in one. A little bit on the dark side of the force, and then turn to the bright side with a long-term view. And I hope very much that with the three panels that we have tomorrow focused on exactly these topics, we will also give some answers to the difficult questions that have been presented today. So thank you very much, everyone. And I see that there are some Q&A, some open questions. Some of them are direct to some of the panelists today, so I hope that they will be able to address them, or otherwise we will copy them and send it to the different people so that they will be answered. Thank you, everyone, for your participation today. Goodbye.